All right, so my name is Tucker Feyder. I'm a project manager with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers out of the Northwest Colorado branch located in the Grand Junction field office. We also have field offices in Durango, Colorado, Pueblo, Colorado, and Denver, Colorado. Split into two different districts at the moment. We have the Omaha district, which encompasses the Denver field office, and then the Albuquerque district, which encompasses Grand Junction, Pueblo, and Durango. The purpose of this presentation today was hoping to just kind of touch on some common general permits and exemptions we see in the agricultural field. Hopefully this will be useful when you're out in the field working on ditches and diversions and things like that, to kind of give you a general feel for when you might need a permit, when you might be exempt, and hopefully just so you feel comfortable talking to the Corps if you ever have any questions that should arise. So as I just stated, some of the objectives here today are to touch on some of the common exemptions we see in the agricultural field, as well as some of the general permits, nationwide permits and regional general permits that are most commonly used in Colorado. The Corps' mission, of course, is to balance development with protection of the aquatic environment. I think it's important to note that the Corps is not a proponent or opponent of any project. We're simply here to enforce the Clean Water Act and all the regulations associated with that. So Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, this is where the Corps derives their regulatory authority over freshwater resources. Purpose is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of these waters. And waters of the U.S. as defined at 33 CFR Part 328, also known as jurisdictional waters of the U.S., include oceans, rivers and streams, lakes and ponds, some wetlands, and some springs. In rivers, streams, lakes, and ponds, our jurisdiction begins at the ordinary high water mark. Anything below the ordinary high water mark is considered jurisdictional under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. Beyond the ordinary high water mark, when you get into wetlands, our jurisdiction begins at that kind of the boundary between where the wetlands kind of transition into upland. It's known as a delineation. We'll go out and delineate boundaries, or consultants can delineate those boundaries. And that kind of gives us a starting point as to where we might start regulating a project. Two things need to occur for a project to be regulated by the Corps. We need activity jurisdiction, which is a discharge of fill material in this case. We need geographic jurisdiction. So this would be the waters of the U.S. If you're discharging fill material into uplands, you may have triggered the activity jurisdiction, but we don't have geographic jurisdiction, that is, in uplands. So a permit is not required for something like that. On the flip side, there's a few activities that we don't regulate, such as above ground vegetation clearing, for example. So that activity is not regulated. So even if you're doing above ground vegetation clearing in a geographically jurisdictional resource, such as a wetland, you've not triggered both parts of this test. Still no permit required. A permit would be required if you are going to discharge that fill material into a geographic waters of the U.S., such as rivers, streams, lakes, ponds, wetlands. So delineation, an aquatic resource delineation, often referred to as a wetland delineation, just identifies the boundaries and acreage of any aquatic resource that might be in a review area. It does not make any claims towards jurisdiction yet. We can verify these things. We call them aquatic resource delineation verifications, where the Corps will confirm or concur with a delineation. We can go out and say, yes, we concur with, that's where the wetland ends. This is where uplands begin. If your project's up in the uplands, no permit required from that point on. On the flip side, if you're down in the wetlands, potentially need a permit, or we can look for an exemption, things like that. It just kind of determines where that boundary is, where that line is between upland and wetland, or the ordinary high water mark. It kind of determines that boundary of where jurisdiction might begin for us. And then jurisdictional determinations. We don't get into these a whole lot on the West Slope. I know they're a little more prominent on the Front Range. They do quite a few more jurisdictional determinations. This is a legal determination that the Corps is making based on a delineation that an aquatic resource is or is not jurisdictional. It's basically a yes, no, a snapshot in time. Yes, this area contains waters of the U.S., or no, it does not. This can help with permitting options. If a resource is non-jurisdictional, no permit required for activities within that resource. But within Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, there are a few activities that are not regulated that I'd like to touch on. Most common non-regulated activities are those that are considered exempt under Section 404F of the Clean Water Act. And I'll go a little bit more into those on the next slide. Those are things like your maintenance exemption, your irrigation exemption. A couple other items that are non-regulated activities for the Corps are excavation activities that contain incidental fallback only. You might hear this referred to as clean excavation or excavation only. So this would mean, excavation where the only discharge of fill would be incidental fallback coming, say, out of the bucket, kind of like that picture on the upper right. And this is assuming that that material is cleanly excavated, as clean as possible at least, and disposed of in an upland area. If you were to sidecast that into, say, a wetland or somewhere else within an aquatic resource, that would be a discharge of fill that would then become a regulated activity. Clean excavation, dredging material straight out of the ground and cleanly disposing of it in an upland location, that meets the excavation only definition, and therefore there would be no discharge of fill. We have no regulatory authority yet. The second there is a discharge of fill, that triggers the Corps regulatory authority, and there better be a permit or an exemption with it. Another non-regulated activity we see is cutting of vegetation above the ground, no root disturbance. It's kind of like mowing, things like that. That picture on the upper left is a pretty good example. As long as there's no, deep ripping of roots with massive amounts of ground disturbance, as long as you don't have that and it's above the ground, there's no discharge of fill associated with it, no permit required. Another item, pilings, for example, say like a driven post, a fence post or something like that. Those aren't typically regulated unless they have the effect of fill. So if you were to stack up, say, a couple dozen posts all within close proximity, so they gathered sediment, slowed the flow of water, altered the circulation, things like that, that has the effect of fill. We may have to step in and regulate that. But say, cattle exclusion fencing, something like that, if they're just on pilings, doesn't have the effect of fill, non-regulated activity from the Corps' perspective.